Have you ever stood in a place you built with your own two hands, only to be treated like you didn't belong there? That was exactly how Malcolm Evans felt as he stepped into the marble lobby of the newest branch of Velvet Shore, the luxury hotel chain he founded from scratch. At 45, Malcolm wasn't just a CEO, he was a visionary who had turned old motels into five-star destinations. But on this particular afternoon in Miami, dressed in a plain button-up and worn leather shoes, he wasn't greeted like a hotel mogul. Instead, a young receptionist barely looked up, assuming he was a confused passerby or someone looking for directions. She didn't recognize his name, didn't bother checking the system, and definitely didn't know she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. Malcolm Evans wasn't the kind of CEO who needed the spotlight. At 45, he had built Velvet Shore into one of the most respected names in luxury hospitality, yet he remained deeply grounded. While other executives relied on press releases and boardroom briefings, Malcolm believed in showing up, especially when things went wrong. Over the past few months, he'd received troubling guest complaints from the Miami branch. Stories about dismissive service, subtle discrimination, and a front desk that seemed to pick and choose who deserved respect. Instead of sending in an auditor or firing off an email, Malcolm booked a room under his own name and flew in without warning. No entourage, no designer suit. Just him, a plain blue shirt, well-worn jeans, and a carry-on bag that had seen more miles than most people's passports. He walked in through the front doors like any guest would, curious to see whether the service lived up to the brand's promise. Behind the front desk stood Eleanor Carter, 25, a polished, confident young woman with sleek blonde hair and a smartphone never far from her hand. She didn't look up when Malcolm approached. When she finally did, it was with that fleeting glance people give someone they've already made their minds up about. Maybe it was the simplicity of his clothes, or the fact that he came in alone, but in that instant, Elena decided he wasn't worth her full attention. She assumed he was lost, or worse, a man looking for shelter in the wrong place. She offered a dismissive, "Can I help you?" That sounded more like, "Why are you here?" than genuine customer service. Malcolm stayed calm, giving his name and reservation details, but she barely typed, made no eye contact, and seemed intent on getting him out of her sight. She didn't recognize him, not as a guest, and certainly not as the man who owned the building she worked in. There was no malice in her tone, just that sharp, professional indifference that said everything. "You don't belong here." Malcolm had seen it before, had lived it in fact. It wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. To someone like Elena, his presence in that lobby didn't make sense. How could someone who looked so ordinary have a room booked at a place like Velvet Shore? And more importantly, how could he deserve to be treated with dignity? The irony, of course, was lost on her. She had no idea she was speaking to the man who had signed her paycheck. Malcolm didn't flinch. He'd come here for a reason, and now he was certain something was broken in his brand. And he intended to fix it, starting with this very moment. When Malcolm politely gave his name and said he had a reservation, Eleanor didn't even pretend to search thoroughly. She typed a few keys with exaggerated slowness, then looked up and shrugged, saying, "Sorry, nothing's showing up in the system." Her voice carried that faint condescension reserved for people she believed didn't belong. When Malcolm calmly showed her the confirmation email, complete with a booking code, room number, and timestamp, she barely glanced at the screen before offering a thin, dismissive smile. "Maybe you made the reservation at a different location," she suggested, not as a helpful clarification, but as a subtle way of saying you clearly don't belong here. Malcolm stayed composed, asking her to double-check, but she waved a hand and said, "There's a motel down the street you might want to try. More in your range." He caught the pause, the unspoken judgment. It was one thing to be ignored, but now he was being redirected like some stray who had wandered in off the sidewalk. Just as he was about to insist again, she tapped a few more keys, sighed, and said, "Okay, I did find one room available. It's not great, but it's something." She handed him a key to room 107, one of the worst rooms in the building, tucked next to the trash area with a scenic view of the back alley. Malcolm recognized the number immediately. He had designed this hotel himself. That room was usually used as an overflow space for maintenance crew or late check-ins during storms. never for VIPs, let alone full-paying guests. When Malcolm walked away from the desk and reached the elevator, he didn't go to the room. Instead, he took out his second phone, logged into the hotel's internal operations system, and pulled up the reservation logs. Within seconds, he found the truth staring back at him. His booking had been manually deleted less than 30 minutes ago. The user ID attached to the deletion, Elena Carter. Not a glitch, not a system error, a deliberate action taken by someone who, in a 5-second glance, decided he didn't belong here. Malcolm's jaw clenched, not from anger, but from confirmation. This wasn't just a customer service failure, it was personal. He scrolled further and saw her activity log: reservation access, deletion, assignment of room 107. All time-stamped, all traceable. She had looked at him and made a decision, one she thought would never catch up to her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the nobody she had tried to dismiss was the man who had founded Velvet Shore, designed every inch of that property, and signed every paycheck in the building. The conflict was no longer hypothetical, it was real. And Malcolm Evans was done being silent. As Malcolm continued digging through the internal records, what started as a single act of misconduct quickly unraveled into something much deeper. Elena's name popped up again and again in previous incident reports, some formal, others quietly logged by night staff or overlooked in customer service follow-ups. Guest complaints ranged from unfriendly tone to unexplained reservation cancellations. To a particularly damning note, guests suspected discriminatory behavior from front desk agent, refused to serve customer before checking ID. These weren't isolated cases, they were patterns. Worse, they had been ignored. Malcolm clicked into each report, reading timestamps, staff responses, and ultimately the glaring absence of meaningful consequences. Most ended with a note from the hotel manager, David Tran, stating that the situation was handled verbally, or training had been offered. David, 38, a competent but conflict-averse manager, had been with Velvet Shore for 5 years. On paper, he looked solid, but in practice, Malcolm could see what was happening. David avoided confrontation at all costs. Rather than address problems head-on, he swept them under the rug. Anytime a guest raised a concern, it was met with vague apologies and promises to look into it. Nothing more. David wasn't malicious, but he was weak, and in a business like hospitality, that weakness could be just as dangerous as ill intent. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. The problem wasn't just Elena, she was a symptom. The real issue was cultural. A system that allowed repeat offenders to stay employed, that failed to protect guests from mistreatment, and that made it easier to ignore than to intervene. That's what was broken. Velvet Shore was built on the promise that every guest, regardless of who they were or how they looked, would be treated like royalty. Somewhere along the line, that promise had been compromised, and the cracks had spread farther than Malcolm wanted to admit. He had built an empire rooted in excellence, but he couldn't fix what he didn't see. Now he saw it. Clearly. This wasn't just about one woman who had judged him. It was about a leadership failure that had allowed people like her to thrive unchecked. It was about a manager who feared accountability more than misconduct. Malcolm had always believed in second chances, but only when someone took responsibility. As of now, no one had, and that realization lit a fire in him. It wasn't just time to fix a mistake, it was time to clean house. Malcolm didn't just want retribution, he wanted restoration. The kind that came from rebuilding a culture, not just correcting a single error. The company carried his name, his vision, and his values. If those values weren't being lived out at the front desk, then everything above it, the reputation, the brand, the legacy, meant nothing. And Malcolm Evans wasn't about to let that happen, not on his watch. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the manager's office, past confused bellhops and curious guests, and knocked once before stepping in. David Tran looked up from his desk, clearly startled. "Mr. Evans, what a surprise," he stammered, half rising from his chair. Malcolm didn't waste time with pleasantries. "David," he said calmly, "I need you to do something for me. Right now, in the lobby, in front of everyone." David blinked, his face pale. "You're going to fire Elena, immediately." The words hit like a slap. "But sir, maybe we should talk privately." Malcolm cut him off. "There's nothing private about what just happened. She humiliated a guest. She violated protocol. She tampered with the system. And she did it because of how I looked." David swallowed hard, hesitating. But something in Malcolm's voice, measured, firm, absolutely certain, told him there would be no negotiation. 2 minutes later, the entire lobby watched as David approached the front desk, his hands trembling slightly. Eleanor looked up, confused, then concerned. "Elena," David began, his voice shaking, "I need to inform you that your employment here is being terminated, effective immediately." Silence swept across the room like a wave. Elena blinked. "What? Wait, what are you talking about?" Her voice rose. "This is a mistake. I was just following procedure. That guy was rude. He probably booked the wrong hotel." She pointed in Malcolm's direction, her face flushed with anger. "I didn't know who he was," she shouted. "If I had known—" But she stopped herself too late. Her own words echoed back at her, condemning. If I had known, as if respect should be reserved only for those with status. Guests nearby looked at one another in disbelief. A young couple gasped. A man standing by the elevator whispered, "What's going on?" Malcolm stepped forward, standing beside David. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "You didn't know who I was," he repeated, looking directly at Elena. "That's true." He paused, then added, "But that shouldn't have mattered." Her expression faltered. Malcolm glanced around the room, now filled with silent attention. "Let me clarify something," he said, raising his voice slightly, not shouting, but commanding. "I'm not just some guy who wandered off the street. I'm the one who laid the first brick in this hotel. I designed the layout, hired the opening team, and built the Velvet Shore brand from scratch." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then someone, an older woman near the lounge, let out a soft gasp. A bellhop murmured, "Oh my God, that's Malcolm Evans." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Guests who had dismissed him now looked at him with wide eyes. Staff who hadn't acknowledged him suddenly stood straighter. Eleanor froze, her mouth slightly open, the color draining from her face. She had misjudged the one person she couldn't afford to. And now the truth was out. The man she had dismissed as unimportant was the very foundation of the place she worked, and there would be no coming back from that. Malcolm knew that justice couldn't stop at one public firing. It had to ripple through the foundation of the company he'd built. The next morning, the Miami branch of Velvet Shore was officially closed for a full internal audit. Guests received personal apologies, room credits, and upgrades for future stays, while those who had previously filed complaints, ignored or buried in the system, were contacted directly and compensated. Malcolm made it clear, this wasn't damage control, it was course correction. Eleanor's termination was processed not just locally, but entered into the corporate database as a permanent flag, effectively blacklisting her from any position within Velvet Shore or its partners. There would be no quiet rehiring, no backdoor transfers. But Malcolm wasn't just there to punish, he was there to rebuild. David Tran, while deeply flawed in his leadership, wasn't malicious. He had failed, yes, but Malcolm believed in accountability paired with opportunity. David was given one final chance, but this time under direct corporate supervision. A regional director was assigned to shadow the Miami branch for the next 90 days, with weekly reports going straight to Malcolm's desk. If there was even a hint of backsliding, David would be out. No excuses. No warnings. Beyond that, Malcolm initiated something far more impactful, a mandatory retraining program across all Velvet Shore locations. Every employee, from front desk staff to general managers, would attend workshops on racial bias, customer dignity, and professional accountability. These weren't going to be hollow HR videos or generic PowerPoint slides. Malcolm hired experts, former hospitality executives, diversity consultants, even past guests who had experienced discrimination firsthand, to speak directly to the team. The sessions were raw, honest, and often uncomfortable. But that was the point. Malcolm wanted his employees to understand that excellence in service wasn't just about folded towels and fresh mints on pillows. It was about making every single guest feel seen, respected, and valued. He even took the first session himself, standing in front of a packed room in Los Angeles and telling the Miami story word for word. Not to shame, but to teach. You never know who's standing in front of you, he told them, so treat everyone like they matter, because they do. Titles don't make people important. Humanity does. The reaction was immediate. Employees clapped, some cried, a few even apologized for moments in the past when they'd failed to live up to the brand's values. Slowly, the Velvet Shore culture began to shift, not through slogans, but through realignment. Malcolm didn't stop there. He began reviewing hiring protocols, staff evaluations, and even the anonymous guest feedback loop. He wanted transparency, accountability, and above all, integrity woven into every level of his operation. What had started as one bad night became the turning point for a better future. And through it all, Malcolm remained hands-on, not because he had to, but because he cared. The empire he built bore his name, but now it would better reflect his values. Not just luxurious, not just world-class, but just. And that, to Malcolm Evans, mattered more than 5 stars ever could. A week later, during one of the company-wide training sessions held at Velvet Shore's Chicago branch, a new front desk employee raised their hand during a Q&A. The room had been quiet, reflective. Many of the staff were still absorbing the changes that had shaken the company over the past few days. Mr. Evans, the young employee asked, "What would you do if someone who looked homeless walked into the hotel asking for a room?" Malcolm paused for a moment before answering. Then he smiled, not with smugness, but with a quiet kind of clarity that comes from experience. "I'd ask them how I can help," he replied, "because once, not long ago, I walked into one of my own hotels dressed in plain clothes. And I was treated like I didn't even deserve to be seen." The room fell completely silent. He continued, "You never really know who you're speaking to. But more importantly, you don't need to. Everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, no matter what they're wearing, where they come from, or what assumptions you make in your head. And if we can't offer that, then we don't deserve their business." The words landed with weight, not as a performance, but as a philosophy. It was a moment that would be retold across break rooms, HR offices, and team meetings throughout the company. The CEO who was mistaken for a nobody, and instead of erupting in anger, rebuilt his empire with deeper roots in justice and dignity. Success doesn't exempt you from discrimination, but it does give you the platform to dismantle it. Malcolm's story reminds us that prejudice isn't always loud or obvious. It can hide in a sigh, a smirk, or the way someone chooses not to look you in the eye. Discrimination often lives in the quiet spaces where judgment replaces understanding and assumptions stand in for kindness. The most dangerous kind of bias is the one that feels normal, the kind that excuses poor behavior because the victim doesn't look the part. But leadership means refusing to let that normalcy slide. A true leader doesn't just correct wrongs. They create a culture where wrongs struggle to exist in the first place. Malcolm didn't raise his voice, threaten lawsuits, or slam doors. Instead, he exposed the truth, held people accountable, and chose to fix the system from the inside out. That's the kind of leadership the world needs, measured, principled, and rooted in a belief that every human being has worth. In a world where appearance is too often mistaken for value, the most powerful thing we can offer one another is simple: dignity. Because what you wear, what you own, or how you look should never determine how you're treated. The real currency in hospitality and in life is respect. And when that becomes the foundation, everything else falls into place. If you found value in this story, if it made you pause, reflect, or even feel a little more seen, then this is just the beginning. We've got more real, raw, and inspiring stories coming your way. Stories that make you think, stories that make you feel, and stories you'll want to share. So don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the X Daily Stories community today. Together, let's celebrate courage, uncover truth, and keep storytelling honest, human, and unforgettable. Because the right story, told at the right time, can change everything.